Good evening, and thank you once again for joining us for another Daily Maverick special webinar on the COVID-19 crisis in South Africa and the world. The focus of tonight's discussion is on the race for a vaccine, a question that becomes, I think, ever more pertinent with each passing day. Before we start, I just want to thank our sponsors, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Foundation, for making this evening possible, and to introduce our two very special expert guests for this evening's discussion. One of them you have met before on one of these webinars. That's Professor Shabir Madhi, a vaccinologist, professor at Wits University, recently appointed as the Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences. Congratulations, Professor Madhi, for 2021 and beyond. He has a CV as long as your arm, and if I was to go through it, there would only be 5 minutes left for this webinar. The second person is equally distinguished, Professor Helen Rees. Helen is the director of the Wits Reproductive Health HIV Research Institute. She's been an activist and a researcher specializing in HIV, in microbicides for HIV, and she is also currently the chairperson of the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, which used to go by the name of the Medicines Control Council, for those of you who may not be up to date. And the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority has a very important role in tonight's story. So Shabir and Helen, good evening, and thank you for joining us.
Hi.
Before I start my interrogation, I just want to try to set the context for this evening's discussion, because it really is a discussion about how we can prevent probably millions of deaths. The first webinar that I did like this was on the 8th of April. It was 2 weeks into the lockdown, and it was with Professor Salim Abdul Karim. And at that point, COVID-19 was something that was happening mainly in other countries. We were watching what was happening in Italy, in Spain, and then in the UK, and we were projecting what might happen in South Africa. But this evening, as we speak, I haven't seen today's statistics, but yesterday, I think we had the largest single day increase in confirmed cases, 7,200 new cases reported yesterday. We had 73 deaths, bringing to over nearly 2,500 the number of tragically lost lives in our country, including many healthcare care workers. So it's no longer something in the distance. It's something which our noses are pressed up against, and many of us, most of us now, I believe, feel it. I should also say that another tragic milestone will be passed today, which is that I think worldwide we will pass the 10 million infections mark. That's 10 million infections in just over 6 months, and probably we will pass the 500,000 deaths due to COVID-19 mark today. So COVID-19 is here. It's very real, and this question of a vaccine is a critical question. So, Helen, Professor Rees, let me start with you. There's a lot of talk about a vaccine, and everybody you talk to, particularly experts like yourselves, all say, well, at best, we're not going to have a vaccine for probably another year, possibly much longer. Why should we be fretting about a vaccine when it is something that seems so distant? What is important about vaccination and vaccines in the history of health, and why is a COVID-19 vaccine so important in your opinion?
Well, I think many people regard vaccines as probably one of the most important tools we have in public health, alongside things like clean water. It's one of the most powerful interventions in terms of lives saved. And it's so good that, in fact, we very often forget that we're using them and that it's saving lives. So, for example, a lot of people will say, well, I don't want to immunize my child because, I don't see measles and I don't see polio. And that's how good vaccines are. These are diseases that without vaccines on this continent certainly would be causing millions of deaths, particularly amongst children every year. We also take it for granted that things like smallpox have been eradicated, and that was eradicated because of a vaccine. And we've just had the Ebola outbreak has just been declared over in the DRC. And one of the major reasons we've been able to do that was because we developed a vaccine incredibly rapidly. So if you want to intervene with vaccine, with outbreaks and pandemics, a vaccine is going to be one of your most critically important tools to prevent infections and to prevent deaths.
Thank you very much. And does the same hold for COVID-19? I mean, this virus appeared on the scene, as I said, 6 months ago. We're learning something new about it every day. Is a vaccine for COVID-19 something that will help us to halt this epidemic? Are there millions of lives at stake, or is that an exaggeration?
We don't know exactly what the trajectory of this pandemic will be over time, but certainly looking at the speed with which we're now seeing people becoming infected and people dying worldwide, I think we could say that over time there could be literally millions of lives at stake. One of the things that global public health discussions has really focused on in recent years is a thing called disease X or pathogen X. And it's called X because we didn't know what it would be. But it was widely thought, and everyone thought it might be pandemic flu. But what we thought about this pathogen was that we had to be prepared for it and prepared to make a vaccine. And we anticipated that it would be an infection that would be respiratory, that would spread around the world really, really rapidly, and that would have high mortality rates. I think now many of us accept that COVID-19 is exactly that pathogen X that we've been anticipating and planning for. So there's been a lot of thought that's gone into the development of vaccines for just such an emergency as we're seeing now.
And yet we were still caught unprepared. It could be said we were caught unprepared, and now we're in a race. Now, Helen, is there a danger that in this rush to develop a vaccine, I mean, normally a vaccine, I believe, takes 10 to 15 years to develop. I hear that the failure rate of vaccine development is up to 90% in most candidate vaccines. Are we moving too fast? And how do people like you, as the chairperson of the SAHPRA, the Health Products Regulatory Authority, the person who must approve Shabir Madhi's vaccine trial, and we'll come to that in a minute, how do we make sure that we're not taking shortcuts? How do we make sure that instead of helping humans, we don't harm humans by a vaccine trial like this? Can you just briefly take us through the steps that will lead us to last week's injecting into a vaccine in human beings in Gauteng to trial COVID-19?
Well, before I do that, I'm just going to say one thing, and that is that we weren't actually caught as flat-footed as you might think, because in fact, there was a lot of work. That's why I say the pathogen X, people were looking at what we call vaccine platforms. These are technologies that you could rapidly put an antigen from in this case, a virus into and develop a vaccine. We also were able to pull out the vaccines that were in development for the first SARS outbreak, which is different. It's a different virus to this, and for MERS. So we were actually able to pull together a lot of technology that was actually being developed. But in terms of your question, how does this work? Well, the first thing you have to understand is, well, what is this pathogen? What is this virus in this case? What does it look like? What is it genetic material? And the Chinese actually released the details of the genetic makeup of this virus very, very early on in the outbreak. That's incredibly important because that allows vaccine manufacturers then to design a vaccine that will be able to attack and be able to recognize and attack the virus. And there are many different ways of doing this. You can either weaken the virus or kill the virus and use that, or you can use proteins from it, or you can use the genetic material, nucleic acid as we call it. There are different bits of that virus that we can take, we can put into different types of vaccine technology. And then when we give it to somebody, it stimulates the immune system. The body thinks that it's seeing the real virus. It mounts an immune response and it remembers it. So when the actual virus comes along, the body says, aha, I've seen this before, I recognize it, and kicks straight into action. And either stops infection or makes the infection much less severe. So in order to do that, the steps we go through are, first of all, people will then look at this candidate vaccine in the laboratory, look at it in different ways in cells. They'll look at how it seems to act in respect to the virus. There will be animal models that will be developed specifically.
So has this vaccine gone through those stages already?
Yes, it has, very quickly. So animal models.
As we were preparing for this webinar, I got a letter from somebody in Geneva saying they're taking shortcuts. There's been no animal experimentation. There's been none of the basic science done. Has it been done?
Shabir is going to tell you about this one.
Good.
Some of them have got animal model data. Some of them have not got animal model data, but are using other technologies to check particularly on safety. So once you've gone through the lab phase, the animal model phase, then you go into humans. And your first trials you do in human subjects, you have a small number of healthy human subjects who are volunteers, who understand that there could be risks. But by then, you've got a good sense of what would be the kind of risk that this sort of vaccine might cause? What should I be looking out for? Have I seen any of those things in the animal models, for example? Then you use that vaccine in a healthy human subject. You look at safety. You look at the amount of vaccine you need to give to stimulate the kind of immune response that you want to get, that you think will be protective. If that's successful, and safety is the most important thing, you then go to a larger number, a larger group, which is called, that's a phase 1 trial. We now go to a 2A trial. Again, volunteers, healthy human subjects. Again, we look at safety and we look at the immune response, and we look at whether there are sort of side effects like sore arms or fever or things like that. And then you go to a much larger group. Now you're in this case, into thousands. And again, you're looking at safety, you're looking at the immune response, and you're starting to look at whether the vaccine works or not. So you're looking now in populations where you expect to see the infection. And finally, you have these very large trials of tens of thousands of people probably, where you're then looking at, does the vaccine actually work? But one last thing to round this up, because you're asking about safety, which is very important. Because we're doing it so rapidly, safety will be at the top of what we look at all the time. And Shabir will explain how we do that in the trial itself. SAHPRA is the regulatory authority that approves the protocol and gets all the safety reports that come out continuously from the trial. We don't wait to the end of the trial and then get a safety report. Every single event that might be a safety signal of any sort comes through to SAHPRA. Other issues where we're worried about the conduct of the trial will also go through to the ethics committee that's also approved it. But I think Shabir will talk to you about the specifics of how we monitor safety in the trial.
Well, let's move to the specifics. Thanks, Helen. So just to finish with you for the time being, SAHPRA has approved this trial.
Yes.
The WITS Human Subjects Research Ethics Committee, I believe, has approved this trial. You are satisfied that all the necessary checks and balances and standards are in place. And SAHPRA is made up of a range of experts like yourself who are asked to evaluate this type of thing before you start playing with human beings. So thank you for that background. I'm going to come back to you in a minute, Helen, but I want to turn now to Shabir, who is I think we call it the principal investigator, and the trial is called the OX1-CoV-19 Vaccine VIDA trial. Shabir, can you just set out some of the kind of basics of what this trial is about, who the trial is taking place on, and what it aims to achieve.
So good evening, Mark, and certainly I'll do that. Mark, if you just allow me 1 minute, I think we just need to reflect on something that you introduced right at the start, and those were the numbers that you were sort of rattling off in terms of the number of people that have been infected and the number of people that have died. And I think what we need to be clear about is that those are really the conservative estimates in terms of the number of people that have been infected as well as the number of people that have died. In South Africa alone right now, my estimate, and I don't want to go into the detail, is that the true number of people that have been infected already exceeds 1 million. It's probably close to 1.2 million right now, but we don't want to go into the detail. So these numbers that are reported, and especially from sub-Saharan Africa, are a complete underestimate, both in terms of number of cases as well as number of deaths that have actually occurred. So going back to the study, so I think just to clear the path, this study has been done in South Africa. The study currently is underway in the United Kingdom. It was a study that was started early in April. And in the United Kingdom, as Helen mentioned, it started off with a phase 1 study, and they've subsequently gone on to a phase 2B study. Right now in the United Kingdom, they're targeting enrolling 10,000 participants, of whom they've already enrolled 7,000 participants. So those 7,000 participants in the United Kingdom were actually enrolled before we even got started in South Africa. Now, this is not an instance of investigators from the United Kingdom coming to me in South Africa, asking me if we're wanting to do a study in South Africa. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. Because of my previous associations with the investigators in the United Kingdom, I personally was the one that actually approached them for the study to be undertaken in South Africa. And they basically indicated that they would be willing to collaborate on this, but they simply don't have funds to support the study in South Africa. And I think there's something really important to understand. Unlike vaccines for TB or HIV or malaria, which are essentially problems existing in low middle income countries, where the only place that you can actually do these clinical trials to show that it actually is safe as well as that it works is in low middle income countries. Right now, there's huge amount of competition, in fact, among scientists wanting to do COVID-19 vaccine studies throughout the world, and especially in high-income countries. This is not a unique problem to sub-Saharan Africa or to low-middle-income countries.
No.
So there's a number of studies that are already underway in humans. There's six vaccines now, of which this is one, which is furthest in the clinical development, that are currently underway in humans. All of the studies right now, besides the study in South Africa, are studies that are taking place in high-income countries. So what are we doing in South Africa? We're really doing a phase 1, phase 2 study. Phase 1 in terms of starting off with
let me interrupt you for a second before you go there, but will you explain simply why? Does the epidemic have a different profile in South Africa that would warrant a South African trial? Can't you just take what is learned in England or the United States and apply it to South Africa? Is there something that you're looking for here that may not exist in other countries? And very brief, Shabir, because I want to then move on to what you're doing. Yeah.
So the legacy of vaccines is that the life-saving vaccines have been actually delayed in terms of its introduction into low middle income countries because of the lack of information in terms of how well they will perform. And there's a number of vaccines, rotavirus vaccine, pneumococcal vaccine, I can rattle off the vaccines, which shows a difference in terms of efficacy between high-income countries and low-middle-income countries. And WHO doesn't recommend for introduction of a vaccine into low-middle-income countries until you're basically able to show in that context that the vaccine works. So there's a number of reasons that can influence why vaccines work differentially between different settings. So if we don't generate evidence right now, we will never know just how well these vaccines will or will not work in our local context. So generating the information, the data now, basically prepares us to make informed decisions in terms of which vaccines would be most efficacious in our own setting.
Thanks. Thank you.
So what are we pretty much doing? We're basically enrolling up to 2,000 participants. There's 3 parts to it. There's 2 small components, which is sort of a phase 1 in people with and without HIV. And this is just to look at detailed information in terms of the immune responses to the vaccine, as well as issues around the safety and whether we need 1 or 2 doses of the vaccine. The reason we're limiting it to a small group of people with HIV is we're really trying to get proof of concept in terms of protection in a generally healthy population without the HIV, and using the immune responses, we can then make some extrapolations as to how the vaccine would actually work in people without HIV in the same locality without needing to do a large study. But we're wanting to take a relatively healthy population first to show whether this vaccine is safe, as well as whether the vaccine actually works. As a summary, what we're doing is that we're asking volunteers to come forward, and then they would be basically screened to see whether they're eligible for participation. We're looking at participants between the age of 18 to 65. People with underlying medical conditions are allowed into the study, provided they're actually well controlled in terms of the underlying conditions, such as diabetes, such as hypertension. At that point, once they enter into the study, after having gone through a detailed process in terms of what's required for participation of the study, as well as having a questionnaire administered to gauge their understanding in terms of what the study is all about, what the risks are involved. So only after a person shows competency in terms of understanding of the study would they be allowed to actually participate in the study. We then allocate them to one of two groups.
Is that just by signing a questionnaire? Because sometimes people will just sign a questionnaire thinking, okay, this may be good for me further down. I mean, do all the 2,000 people really know what's going on? Can you assure me they're not guinea pigs in some bigger agenda of somebody else, some rich advanced country or something?
Right. So there's an informed consent which they need to sign. But before they sign that informed consent, we go through the entire study, they actually read through it, and then we actually administer a questionnaire. And we've already actually prevented people from forming part of the volunteers because we didn't believe that they had an adequate understanding in terms of what the study actually involved. So they need to score at least 80% on a questionnaire which we administer. It's got multiple questions. And if they don't score 80%, we provide them another opportunity to re-explain it. But if they still do not score 80% on that questionnaire, they're actually not allowed to participate in the study. So it's really to ensure that people understand what they're getting into, what the risks are involved, and why we're actually doing this, most importantly.
And you can put your hand on your heart and say they understand that.
Well, they understand it to the extent that we actually evaluate for. I mean, at the end of the day, there are many scientists involved in this that would be involved in the study that wouldn't fully understand every intricacy of the vaccine, obviously. So there's a level of understanding that's required, which we ensure that participants do achieve before we actually allow them to be enrolled into the study.
Okay, so, I'm going to pause you just for 1 second, Shabir. Helen, is there any community oversight over vaccines like this? Because Shabir talks about scientists and questionnaires, but we all know that the language of scientists is not the language of community. Is it just experts like you that decide that people understand, or is there other levels of oversight?
So in fact, one of the things that I think that we will see for all of the vaccine studies, this is the first, but there will be more, and there'll be different types of vaccines evaluated over time. But one of the things is that this is only going to be done in clinical trial sites that really are experienced and know what they're doing. And in fact, one of our big advantages is that we have learned so much from doing HIV work in particular, and TB work, but particularly HIV work. So the sites that are participating have what are called community advisory boards. And these are drawn from leaders in the community, a whole spectrum of leadership. And those community advisory boards, depending on the kinds of studies that are being done and who's going to be pulled in, if it was adolescent, you would have more adolescent groups on it, for example. But in this case, these are adults from 18 to 65. So the community advisory boards will discuss, first of all, what is the study before it starts, what does it look like? But they are a very important touch point throughout the study because they're the eyes and the ears in the community. They will tell you if they're hearing rumors, if they're not happy, if they will give that feedback. And so that's an incredibly important sort of monitoring, a community monitoring tool that we've developed really well in this country.
Thanks. And I think the point that you make about HIV is really important. I mean, it's an irony that something as horrible as HIV has given us an advantage. But people like you have had years of experience in microbicide development, in failed so far attempts at vaccines, and so on. So as South Africans, we're not coming to this fresh. We're not novices. There's a body of knowledge. Back to Shabir. Shabir, so you've got 2,000 people. That's the target. You've got 4 groups. As I understand it, 1,000 of the 2,000 people will receive what you people call a placebo, which means something that is not a vaccine, is just a neutral, harmless substance. But they won't know that they're getting a placebo. Everybody thinks that they're getting the vaccine, and you use the placebo to measure against the active vaccine. At what point will you start to have some idea as to whether this is working, and how do you monitor what do you watch as you move forward from June 2020 onwards?
So Mark, as you mentioned, the participants are actually allocated randomly to one of the 2 arms, and neither the investigators nor the participants would know which arm they've been allocated to. Now, the things that we actually keep an eye on are 2 main things. The first issue is around safety. If there's any sort of adverse event, especially what we call serious adverse events, those events are actually reported immediately to the regulatory authorities, as well as the independent data and safety monitoring committee that actually meets weekly. And they've got the prerogative to be able to unblind to determine whether or not some participant that experienced a major actually vaccine or not, to actually to halt immediately and to postpone further enrollment. That process has been ongoing with the UK study, the Data and Safety Monitoring Board for the UK study. For the other study that's going to be done in Brazil, and for the South African study, it's exactly the same. It includes a leading South African scientist on the Data and Safety Monitoring Board. So safety is paramount, and we're not going to compromise on safety. This vaccine can work. It might prevent COVID-19, but if the vaccine is found to be unsafe and especially cause serious adverse events, that vaccine will never get past licensure in terms of regulatory pathway. So safety is one. The second part of it, when will we know whether this vaccine works or not? So the way the study is actually designed is that we need to get X number of people that develop COVID-19, and this is not artificially infecting people. This is people getting infected naturally because of the way the virus is actually circulating currently in South Africa. As soon as a fixed number, if we develop COVID-19, at least 1 month after having received the last dose of the vaccine, at that point, we would be able to actually do an analysis to determine whether or not this vaccine provides at least 60% protection. That magic number for us is 42. So there's a whole lot of computations that go into it, but as soon as we get 42 individuals that have developed COVID-19 at least 1 month after having received the last dose of vaccine, we can literally bring the study to an end insofar as we can actually unblind to see whether the vaccine works or not. All of the participants will still be followed up for a full 12-month period, because we also still need to ensure safety of the vaccine at least over a 12-month period. Now, when are we going to get to those 42 participants? Unfortunately, right now, what is happening in Gauteng, what is happening in South Africa, there's such a huge amount of infection that is actually compromising our ability to actually do the study properly, because people are getting infected at a phenomenally high rate. It's unbelievable. Not in my wildest imagination did I think that people are going to get infected as much as they're getting infected right now. So we might be able to get an answer as soon as November right now, simply because, unfortunately, the manner in which this virus is actually spreading through communities. What we're going to see in the next 3 to 4 weeks in Gauteng is going to really be frightening, and that is unfortunate.
Okay. So the irony, the sad irony, if I want you to just clarify this, is that the escalation of the epidemic may serve to the advantage of the vaccine trial, because it will allow us to see more quickly whether the vaccine is efficacious in preventing COVID-19 infections. Is that right?
It will give us an answer sooner than later. So if there's a slow rate of infection, we will still get an answer, but that answer might only come in June of next year rather than in November of this year. So we will still get an answer as to whether the vaccine works or not, because over time, it's very, very likely that 42 out of 2,000 participants are going to develop COVID-19. It's a matter of when and over what period of time they actually develop it.
I've got 2 more questions, then I'm going to come back to Helen, just about the structure of the trial. You've mentioned that a small group, about 50 people living with HIV, are part of the trial and will receive the vaccine or the placebo. And I guess that's because we know there's an additional risk associated with HIV, and because we have so many people living with HIV in this country. But we also know that diabetes and hypertension and old age or being old are risk factors. Are those people included? Are those groups of people included in your trial groups or not?
So we're including everyone up to the age of 65, between 18 and 65. We do include them if they've got diabetes, hypertension, provided that the diabetes and hypertension is well controlled. And there's reasons for that, because if some person's diabetes is not well controlled, they're actually more immunosuppressed. And that's one of the reasons why we're not including HIV-infected individuals at the moment, because it's possible that they're more immunosuppressed and they're not going to mount as good a response. So for a proof of concept study, we're wanting to limit it to individuals that are relatively immunocompetent. That being said, what we'll be able to do with the HIV group eventually is do a relative comparison of the immune responses, and that would allow us to extrapolate as to what the likely efficacy would be in that HIV-infected group.
Thank you very much. I'm seeing so many questions. People are asking about price, about intellectual property, about access, and we're going to come there in the second part of this webinar, and I'm going to ask Helen some of those, well, both of you, but start with Helen. But just one last question, Shabir, for critics or people who are skeptical about this vaccine trial. Why, I mean, it may take a year, 2 years, at the rate things are going at the moment. By the time we have a vaccine, we may have millions of people infected in South Africa. We may have hundreds of millions of people infected in the world. Once you become infected, you develop an immunity, we believe, you develop antibodies. Why all this fuss with the vaccine when the thing could take its natural course and people will develop immunity? Answer the skeptics of vaccine trials and vaccines. And Helen, you might want us to add to this in a second as well.
So I guess as the main unknown about immune responses to natural infection at the moment for SARS coronavirus 2 is twofold. Firstly, the durability of that immune response, and it's the extent to which you actually induce what we call memory responses. So when Helen introduced vaccines earlier, she sort of made mention that one of the strengths of vaccines is that as soon as you expose to the pathogen, your body is able to mount an immediate immune response to it. And that's what we call memory responses. Currently, we don't have data in terms of what is the durability of the immune response to natural infection. In fact, the data that we do have is somewhat disappointing in that it shows that by 2 to 3 months, people have lost their antibody. And in fact, even more worrisome is that for the majority of people that develop asymptomatic infections or mild illness, it seems that their immune response, in fact, is less robust than people who recover from severe disease. So we've got a situation where natural infection is inducing immunity, but we don't know the duration of the immunity. We don't know the robustness of that immunity. So we need to our approach needs to be one which provides much more greater security in terms of our ability to induce immediate immunity as well as long-lasting immunity. And vaccines, in fact, are much more predictable in terms of being able to do that because of the manner in which you can actually present the antigen to the immune system that allows the immune system to be optimized in its response. So that's the reason why, irrespective of whether 60% of the population gets infected to SARS coronavirus over the next 2 years, which is what we predict in the absence of a vaccine, that does not mean that 60% of the population are going to have developed long-lasting immunity, which is what we require to break the chain of transmission of this virus moving forward.
Okay, that was complicated, but time is against us, so I'm not going to try to unpack that. But in some ways, what you're saying is that the body's natural defenses against COVID-19 are far from perfect from what we can see so far. There's a question of what you call the durability, i.e. you may have a protection for a few months, but it may not last for that long. There's issues about immune response in older people who are the very people who are at the greatest risk. And therefore, scientists are having to try to engineer something that can be more efficacious than the body's natural response. Is that it in a nutshell?
That's it, but let me just add one thing, the last bit that you added there, and that is this elderly and those that can't develop a good immune response to the vaccine. Even if the vaccine is not immunogenic, it doesn't actually produce good immune responses. The manner in which a vaccine will actually sort of protect those individuals is through what we call herd immunity. So if we can get 60% of the adult population to develop immunity against this virus, that virus no longer circulates so freely in the community, and even individuals that aren't able to mount a good immune response to the vaccine indirectly are protected now. And so that is a concept of herd immunity, which exists for many, many vaccines.
Okay, gosh, I'm coming to Helen. I've just been watching some of the questions. If this vaccine is successful, will people be forced to take this vaccine? Helen.
Well, if you look around at all the other vaccines that we have, there's very, very little forcing of vaccines. The one thing that people probably are aware of is yellow fever, that if you want to travel into a country which has got yellow fever, you have to have a yellow fever card in order to get in. What we try and do instead of forcing people is really give incentives and explain to people the value. So some countries, for example, won't let you send your child to school unless they've had their childhood vaccines. And they try and incentivize that way to say, if you want your child to come to school, they need to be protected. But it also means that the children who are not able to have vaccines because of perhaps other medical conditions, they are protected because all the other children are protected. So in terms of being forced, that would be quite a difficult thing to do. I think what we would definitely want to do, and I think many people would say this, if we go on like this and we don't have, at the moment we've got things that are looking a little bit better for treatment for severely ill patients. We've got a couple of drugs, but they're not home runs. They don't stop people dying. They just reduce mortality. We've got overwhelmed hospitals now in Gauteng, in the Eastern Cape, and the Western Cape, overwhelmed. And if this keeps coming wave after wave after wave, I think that many people in the population would say, my goodness, if there's a vaccine that works, I would like to take that vaccine. I would want my children, I would want my brother, my sister, my auntie, my uncle, etc., to take that vaccine, because the alternative at the moment is pretty grim, frankly. And we don't know how to break what's happening other than these non-pharmaceutical measures, wearing the mask, washing the hands, distancing. That's the best we've got at the moment. We haven't got drugs yet that will stop infections. We haven't got drugs to treat early infection. And we haven't got cure drugs. So we really need a vaccine to break that transmission. So I think that would be the way that we would incentivize. The one group that we might want to say, we really want you to have this, and this would be a discussion, would be healthcare workers and other critical frontline workers. But it would obviously be a discussion with representatives of those workers. But my experience of healthcare workers at the moment, if there was a vaccine, most people that I work with would say, thank you very much. I will take that vaccine today.
Thank you. So again, just to emphasize that there's obviously a personal benefit to me taking a vaccine, but it's not just about me. If I protect myself, I protect other people. So there's a public health and a social benefit to advocating for people to take vaccines. Listen, there's many questions around the science. Whenever I do these seminars, I see how thirsty and eager people are for information. We'll share with you some of the questions that haven't been answered. But I want to turn direction a little bit. So Helen, Shabir, and people like yourselves, 12 months' time, we announce that the trial has been successful, or 9 months' time we announce the trial has been successful. We have, I think Shabir said, 60% efficacy, or whatever the figure is that will allow you to consider it a success. But then we have a kind of $1 trillion question, or like a set of $1 trillion questions about which center on global power relations and inequality. We have a great vaccine, but who owns the vaccine? Who profits from the vaccine? I mean, I would imagine with something that has a market of 8 billion people nearly, there's a lot of money to be made from a COVID-19 vaccine. Is this an issue that you people have to even bother yourselves about? Or is this an issue for politicians to be concerned about? Helen, let me start with you, because I know that you work with the World Health Organization and so on. What are you doing to try to make sure that a successful vaccine is as available to somebody in Zimbabwe or South Africa or Malawi as it is to somebody in New York or Paris?
It's at the moment, it's an extraordinarily important global health question that's getting an enormous amount of attention. So I'll explain some of what is going on. Globally, a big fund of money has been set up, which is called the ACT Accelerator. And there are 3 pillars of activity under that. They are for vaccine development, for therapeutics development, and for diagnostics development. And the money that's gone into that fund has come from countries, from philanthropic agencies, from a whole range. But it's a central fund, and that money is now being apportioned. Now, for vaccines, there are 3 organizations that are involved in vaccines, and they all got different portfolios. One is called CEPI, which stands for the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation. They are responsible for vaccine development, but in parallel to that, they are going out and finding manufacturers, because there's no point having the Chadox vaccine, the one we're talking about now. We get a successful result and we haven't thought about how we're going to manufacture millions and billions of doses. So in parallel, CEPI, as it's called, is looking at the development of the vaccines, but also the manufacturing now. And the manufacturing investment has been done at risk, because we don't know which vaccines will or won't work. The second group is Gavi, which is the Vaccine Alliance, which supports the poorest 70+ countries in the world to purchase vaccines and to get health systems strengthened for immunization. They are responsible for looking at how is access to those vaccines and distribution of those vaccines going to occur. And they're even looking at things like what cold chain is required. Do you need to invest in fridges to keep the vaccines, and all of those questions. So Gavi is looking at that. And the third group is the World Health Organization, that's looking at the policy and the prioritization. So they're making the strategic recommendations. So they might say, for example, if at the end of all of this, we've got 1 successful vaccine at the end of next year, but we've only got 200 million doses, who are we going to give it to? They might say, let's give it to healthcare workers. It'll depend on the vaccine, it'll depend how much. So that is a massive discussion that's going on. And one of the things, and I believe this, is that vaccines under these circumstances must be described as what's called a global public good. That means that they should be equitably made available to everyone in the world, irrespective of whether you're a big or a small country or a rich or a poor country. This isn't, at this point, with a pandemic, this is truly about global equity, and we're going to have to think how we do that.
Thanks, Helen. This is where I become a little bit more of a skeptic, because I, like you, have seen the profiteering from health crises like HIV, like TB, like everything else. We're seeing the profiteering around access to COVID-19 PCR tests, etc. There's a lot of fine language about, and probably there's never been so much fine language coming out of the World Health Organization and the bodies that you've mentioned about equality of access, etc. But I need to see something concrete. Somebody today, and I'll ask this to Shabir from Médecins Sans Frontières, said to me, you know, everybody's talking about procurement. Yes, you know, we'll have a step up the ladder in procurement to South Africa because we participated in this trial. But you mentioned it, Helen. What about production capacity? If all the capacity to produce vaccines resides in Europe and the United States, and none or very little resides in Africa, then isn't that just like a natural barrier to this great scientific breakthrough? Shabir, are we going to be able to produce your vaccine, should we be successful, to make sure that this promise is realized?
Yeah, so Mark, I think that's an exceptional question. And the whole reality is that Sub-Saharan African countries, unfortunately, have not invested in terms of developing capacity and capabilities to produce vaccine. And the bottom line is we'll be fooling ourselves if we believe that we're going to be able to achieve it over the next 2 years, especially for vaccine such as the Chadox vaccine. So unfortunately, that's not going to happen. But that is no fault of the people that have invented these vaccines. That is a responsibility which governments of these countries need to assume, because we have not invested, and that's the reason we're always at the mercy of every other pharmaceutical company. The same thing happened in 2009 with the swine flu pandemic. We received the vaccine after the pandemic was over, which is completely unacceptable. But governments simply have not learned their lessons. So yes, place the blame on industry for wanting to make money, but there's equal amount of blame to be apportioned on countries for not investing in science and technology, to not ensure that we've got the capabilities to be able to produce these vaccines.
Are we investing? Helen, are we investing? Yeah.
So Mark, let me just, so in terms of the Chadox vaccine, so the IP for that was held by University of Oxford, and it's been passed over to AstraZeneca. AstraZeneca, the agreement between, correct. So the agreement between University of Oxford,
yeah.
The agreement between University of Oxford and AstraZeneca is that AstraZeneca will produce a vaccine and won't make a profit on it during the course of the pandemic. COVID-19 is not going to go away after this pandemic. It's going to be there, and we're still going to need, there's going to be an ongoing need for a vaccine. Now, to be able to address the issue in terms of quantity, you do not develop a manufacturing plant to produce billions of doses of vaccine for 2 years, and after that, you need 100 million of doses of vaccine. So AstraZeneca have gone public that they actually engaging with Serum Institute in India for Serum Institute in India to also produce vaccine. Right, and we know that Serum Institute of India, as an example, provides 75% of all of the vaccines that they use in public immunization programs of low middle-income countries, and they provide it at a very nominal cost. So our best hope right now is firstly for the vaccine to work, and then for there to be sufficient amount of vaccine that's produced by manufacturers in other low middle-income countries, most of which currently are in South Asia.
Thank you. Helen, I mean, both of you are members of the Ministerial Advisory Committee on COVID-19. Is there any discussion about developing productive capacity for vaccines in South Africa at the moment? We've heard in the past about state pharmaceutical company. Is this in the works? Should it be in the works?
Well, there is discussion about it. The Department of Science and Innovation is looking at we have some companies that have some limited capacity in terms of aspects of vaccine manufacturing. So there is a focus looking at this. But as Shabir said, to produce vaccines, I mean, he mentioned the Serum Institute of India. I mean, that was working really hard and not very successful for 10 years before it got anywhere near it is today. It's been going now for about 30 years. And it takes a really long time. One of the things, however, in the vaccine candidates that we're looking at is that one of the reasons why there are so many different types of vaccines, and it's not just one or two types and lots of people trying for the same thing, is that we're also looking not only having a variety of types to make sure that something works, that we can crack this, but also that some types of formulations of vaccines are much easier to manufacture than others and can be done really quickly and to scale. So that's another consideration, so that we want to have vaccines that work, and we know we're going to have failures, but we also want to have some vaccines that we can rapidly scale up so we can get billions of doses, which is what we're going to need.
Thank you very much. Are you saying that Helen, you talked about the global public good. Do you think that intellectual property will not be an obstacle in this instance with a COVID-19 vaccine, whether it's this candidate or whether it's some other candidate? Do you think that is a historical issue that won't be a problem here?
I'm sure it will be a problem. I'm sure it will, because as Shabir said, this is going to be a vaccine that's going to be needed in the billions of doses, and many pharmaceutical companies are investing a lot, and they're doing it at risk. So they are investing in the same way as we just described. They're investing in the development of the technology and the clinical trials, but they're also looking at investing in manufacturing, and they're doing it at risk, because if that product doesn't work, That's billions of dollars worth of investment gone. So I think it will be an issue. But the debate that's going on is about saying, we recognize that's an issue, but that vaccine, what's called vaccine nationalism, where a rich country that's got manufacturing capacity, as you just described, says, I'm drawing a border, this is all for me, all for my people, they get it all first, and you in the African region, you will get the crumbs from the table at such time as there are some crumbs to be given. So that debate about vaccine nationalism now is very, very, very critical. And there's a lot of pressure being put on. And WHO certainly, the theme from this, what I've just described to you, this vaccine pillar that I just described to you, the theme there is equity. It's saying we need to be able to prioritize small numbers of vaccines at the beginning, increasing numbers over time, but we need to be able as a world to say who gets it in an equitable manner. So it's going to be, it is going to be an ongoing debate, and it's going to be an ongoing fight. The important thing is that debate hasn't been left to the end, that we're having that debate now. And in fact, a webinar like this for all the colleagues here, I mean, I would love you all, whatever organization you're in, to take up this cry to say, this cannot be all for some and none for many others. This has to be an equitable distribution of vaccine.
Thank you. Shabir, would you like to add? Or are you...
No, I fully agree with Helen, and I think there's already a threat hanging over our heads. And as an example, the United States government has already pre-ordered vaccine from 2 companies. In the absence of any data as to whether it's going to work or not, they've already put in their purchase order for hundreds of millions of doses of vaccine for the United States, going out again at risk. So it's really up to governments to place a stake into the ground right now and make sure that they're in a position to be able to ensure that these vaccines become available across the world.
So we need to continue to watch our own government. And I see there was an African Union conference over the last few days, 2 days last week, on these very issues about vaccine development, vaccine equity, and so on. We're coming almost to the end of the webinar. I want to come back a little bit, almost finish on the science and the health crisis we're facing. I heard Dr. Anthony Fauci tell the US Congress a few days ago that he's relatively optimistic that a vaccine for COVID-19 will be developed. Do you share that optimism? I mean, we've been trying for 20 years, 30 years with HIV, and we're still trying. So do you think it's coming? I know it's a hard question. Start with you as the vaccinologist, Shabir.
No, I'm pretty confident that we'll get a vaccine for COVID-19. I mean, the SARS coronavirus 2 is much, much less complex than TB, HIV, malaria. It's much more genetically stable. Just over a short period of time, we're getting a real good window insight in terms of what might be required for a vaccine to be effective. It's got a very targeted sort of virulent protein, which we know is what we need to target. In the non-human primate studies, which we didn't really discuss, that some of these vaccines have gone into studies. They've already shown with challenge studies in the non-human primates, including with the Oxford vaccine, that it actually protects the non-human primates against a challenge. So I'm fairly confident that we will get the vaccine. We're probably going to have a handful of vaccines developed over the next 5 years. There's going to be a high failure rate, but we'll have more than one vaccine that's developed over the next 12 months that will go through clinical trials. The question is really one of access eventually.
So the science will find a solution. The politics, we're not so certain of. Helen?
No, I agree. I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, we didn't start with a blank sheet. So there were already some candidate vaccines in development for the original SARS outbreak. They didn't proceed because that outbreak burnt itself out. And similarly for MERS, which is another coronavirus, there were vaccines also in development that were also looking and are still in development, that are looking very promising. So we've already got a signal from those 2 experiences with these kinds of coronaviruses that we can develop a vaccine. So I share the optimism. The other thing is that we are trying all sorts of different technologies. There are lots of ways people are trying to trick the immune system into recognizing this virus. And so it's not all, all eggs in one basket at all, which makes me even more optimistic.
Great. So somebody asked a question, Shabir. We're talking about a spike in cases in Gauteng. Is it linked to your starting of a vaccination of the vaccine trial?
No, the spike that's taking place right now is because of infections that took place about 2 to 3 weeks ago. And the huge amount of transmission has been taking place over the past few weeks. We've enrolled about 24 participants right now. So it certainly has got nothing to do with a vaccine trial. It's not a vaccine introducing the virus in the community by any stretch of the imagination. Unfortunately, what's happened in Gauteng, like in many other places in South Africa, is that people have simply not bought into adhering to the non-pharmaceutical interventions. They're not avoiding overcrowded spaces. They're not wearing face masks. They're not ensuring physical distancing. That has fueled the transmission of this virus, which I, not in my wildest imagination, thought would have happened. The number of people that we're diagnosing on a daily basis, which still makes up a fraction of the true number of people that are infected, is absolutely frightening. And
thank you.
All of those infections that we're identifying right now are ones that are going to end up in hospital in 2 to 3 weeks from now.
Thanks, Shabir. Helen, just one for you, and I heard this argument in the days of HIV. Shouldn't we just be concentrating on boosting people's immune systems with nutrition and other natural interventions rather than playing genetically modifying viruses and so on and so on? You've only got 30 or 40 seconds for that, but it's a question.
We don't have any really strong medicines that boost the immune system in such a way that they can overcome a viral infection like this. If we had them, we would be using them now. And we are looking, using artificial intelligence at every registered product, all the gray area products. We're looking at all the complementary medicines products to see which molecules look like they might have an effect. And there is nothing that's coming up that's saying, I can strengthen the immune system in such a way that I can protect people against this really, really aggressive virus.
And what about just ensuring good food for people in our country?
Yeah, this was one of the reasons why having such a strict lockdown in the long term, everyone conceded that this was going to become counterproductive because we were going to have more people becoming hungry. And nutrition is critical, and we knew this for HIV as well. So we have to look at nutrition, you're absolutely right. And one of the most important things that we found is protective is activity. So also encouraging those things that make people's own immune system more robust, which is things like activity and eating well and eating balanced diets. You're quite right. And we have to think about feeding the most vulnerable in our country.
So it's a combination of interventions, of which a vaccine is a critical part, but we're not limiting ourselves to just vaccine development. Well, I'm really sorry, but we've run out of time, and there were probably about 100 questions that I couldn't answer. But I think you've been incredibly helpful, and I just want to say, Helen and Shabir, that we are very proud in South Africa of our scientists and our scientific community, and that we have such important homegrown expertise, and it goes very deep in our country. So thank you for both of your efforts. And before we sign off for this evening, I think it would be remiss of me also not to thank the healthcare workers who this evening, as we talk, are on the front lines of a rapidly escalating crisis in the Western Cape, in the Eastern Cape, and as Shabir mentioned, imminently, in fact, already in Gauteng. You're in our thoughts, as are the people who have lost their lives already. We're now in the middle of this deep crisis. We have to find a way out of it. And it depends upon all of us who have participated tonight, joining hands with our scientific community, together with our government. So thank you for this evening. Thank you for your time. And we'll invite you back because there's many more questions. And this story is only just beginning. But thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mark.
you. Bye-bye.